So, Willie, there's a lot of talk in the culture at the minute about toxic masculinity. Mm-hmm. And I think that in combination with genuine failures of fathers, and there's a whole reason why all this sort of stuff has happened. But there's kind of this idea where it's like, yeah, well, we don't really need men anymore. And so what are some of the problems you think with that vacuum of both men stepping back from their responsibility and then the culture also pushing men to the side? If we lose fathers, what do we lose?
We lose a massive amount. It takes a man and a woman to make a child. I believe it also takes a man and a woman to raise a child. Now, we're in a fallen world, and that's not going to work out perfectly in every situation. But I have to say we are in a culture that is skeptical and antagonistic up to a point about fatherhood. That's not true of everybody, but it's true of substantial amounts of the culture. Women who wanting to have children without having a man in their life, a husband. Men who want to father children and move on and father more children and just move round and work. We dealt with many situations like that. It's interesting, they did a research in a prison in America, and they did an experiment about, on Mother's Day, getting the prisoners to send cards or do something for their mothers, and nearly all of them did it and were moved in doing it and found it very beneficial. They came round to Father's Day and they decided we'll try the same thing. One prisoner did it. So, and it's demonstrated many times, people who end up in prison, significant number have been in care, but because behind that is the breakdown of family, and particularly the loss of effective fatherhood. Some still had their father there, but their father was abusive or neglectful or absent emotionally or even physically, in all sorts of ways, for all sorts of reasons, some better than others. So we are in a culture where fatherhood and patriarchy has become a dirty word, are linked. Male leadership, male authority is spoken against. And that is a culture that's actually resistant to God himself. You go to the last two verses of the Old Testament, and in it, Malachi says that before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes, he will send Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. Now, we've dealt with curses, occult curses, and curses that come about through negative drip feed. You're a wee so-and-so, put your own words in there. You're a fat so-and-so, you're a skinny wee. All the negatives that parents can spew onto children and have the effect of a curse. That's actually difficult enough because it's reparenting that's needed to reaffirm the child's intrinsic value and worth and also what's in them to do. Occult curses, people do put curses on other people through occult processes. We bring them on ourselves through entanglement with the occult, and those can be broken in Jesus' name. We've seen that happen. If God Almighty puts a curse on a nation, by what name or by what authority do you break that? It's a big question. And the absence or the loss of fatherhood is the thing that he says draws that curse down, the danger of God in heaven cursing a nation. Now, he doesn't leave it like that. He sends Elijah. He sends, or Elijah-type ministry to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of children to the fathers, lest he have to say, I've done it, had it with that culture. And it's the fathers that need to be spoken to. It's not the children first, it's the fathers' hearts are turned to the children to value them, not in a sexual way, not in a wrong way. That's hearts that are actually turned away. The child becomes something that you use for your own gratification. But to turn towards the child to say, I'm here for you. I take responsibility in relation to you, my child, my son, my daughter. I have input to give to you. I need it myself. I need an Elijah to come and help me, which is what pastoral care in the church is meant to provide. I need to pass it on. And if fathers embrace that, and we've found fathers almost automatically do that if they really are impacted by the gospel, they want to take on the responsibility in a whole new way towards their children. If they do that, that maximizes the opportunity of the child's heart being turned towards the father. We're back in the parable of the prodigal son. The fact that the father's heart was turned towards his errant child meant that the child beside the pig trough, the young man, say, well, look, I could get a job back in my father's house.
Because he knew his father's heart was turned towards him. Wow,
he knew enough about his father to know he could go back. But the fact that his father's heart was turned, even though his father couldn't see him in the distance, even though he couldn't see the father in the distance, there was something spiritual facilitated in that young man's life to recognize God in something of the fatherhood he'd received, and to know that there would be some sort of welcome. Somebody said, family's the place that it's not, you don't earn, it's when you turn up, they have to take you in, no matter where you've been. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But it's family that's heart is turned to God that respond like that in the main, or ought to. If they don't, if a Christian family doesn't, then there's a serious question about the reality in the father or the parents' lives.
Yeah. That's the first time I've ever heard in my life that a culture that's resistant to fatherhood is actually resistant to God himself.
Absolutely.
And I'd love to, before we kind of get into it, I'd love to zoom in a little bit on that.
You take the book of Malachi.
Yeah.
It ends with this thing about fathers and sons. You go back a chapter and he says, look, you husbands, you've been unfaithful to your wives. There's been domestic violence. I think it's chapter 2. But then you go back to this first chapter and he says, look, if I'm your father, where's my honor and respect? They had actually departed from God before they departed. The men departed from their wives and the children lost out. There's a whole sequence of progression there. Now, it's not the words, those were leaders of the religion at the time that he was speaking to, Levites and so forth, and priests, that priests had done that. So it's not, it's the people who are supposed to be leading the church, the congregation in Israel spiritually had turned away. And that facilitated the demise of faithfulness in marriage as a large issue in the society, which then impacted negatively on many children from those families.
So it's a huge chain reaction.
Huge chain reaction.
Right. The shepherds of the community turn away from God, and then the fathers turn away from the call it the faith, and then their marriages break down, and then their parenthood breaks down, and then those kids go on to just replicate that cycle over and over and over again.
And you go to the New Testament, and the qualification for being a leader in the local congregation is that you have substantially been effective as a father in your own family. That's where you learn the things, including the use of authority in an upbuilding way. It's where you learn values like faithfulness to your wife and so things like that, that you convey through example, through, people just imbibe it because you're living it. It's not just because you say it. It's okay to say it, but if it's not lived, it's not felt. It's what's lived is felt by the children. The children grow up with a picture of what family is meant to be. And if that happens for them, then that's the picture they carry into their own families to replicate.
So in the case of the prisoners who had an absence of fatherhood, what was it about the absence of fatherhood in that situation that contributed to them ending up in jail?
Well, that's a big question.
And it's basically like, what is the role of God in our lives?
If your father is brutal toward you, you carry that sort of attitude into crime into relationships because you're learning how to relate in the family. If he's brutal toward you or uncaring toward you, that can easily be replicated. So it doesn't matter if you hurt somebody. If he's selfish, if he's demonstrating both sexual selfishness in and outside his relationship, or just selfishness in general terms, then that is the spirit that people see, feel, think is normal, carry, and they are selfish in relationships. So if you have something that I want, I take it. It's called stealing. If I need to use violence, I use violence. And all those things then become crimes in society because nobody wants to be punched and beaten up and have their TV stolen or whatever, or their pocketbook. They don't. I heard once of a survey done of 7-year-old children in school, and they were asked the question, what do you think makes a marriage work? And one bright spark at 7 said, well, it's important that they like the same things. For example, if he likes watching sport, it's important that he likes watching sport and that she keeps the chips and dip coming.
Wow.
Now, that is a picture of someone who's learnt that marriage is selfishness and self-indulgence and others serve you. It's funny, but it's actually very, very sad because the child who said that already has an idea of what it means to be a father, to be a husband. Now, nobody's ever told him that. He has seen that and taken it in, and if you asked him, he probably couldn't tell you unless you asked the right question. He doesn't realise he carries that. But that's the picture he live out of, which is why the pictures and how we see our children, how we see ourselves as parents are so important.
More is caught than taught.
Absolutely. Somebody said, if I preach mumps but have measles, what do you count?
That's a zinger. So if we go into kind of like our origins, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say there's a New Testament parallel statement to the end of Malachi. It's at the start of Luke, and it's a wonderful statement. Luke at the start gives the first new material in the New Testament. John goes right back to creation, but there's stuff about creation in the Old Testament. Matthew does all the genealogies, but that's all in the Old Testament. Mark starts with the ministry of John the Baptist. Luke starts with the birth of John the Baptist, the angel coming to Zechariah in the temple and saying, you're going to have a son, I'm going to call him John, and all of that. And it said, the prophetic word from the angel is, and he shall about John, he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, not their children, the children, and the disobedient to the ways of the just, to prepare the people for the Lord. Something like that. In other words, when the hearts are turned, it not only benefits the relationship between father and child, it prepares the nation for the Lord.
Really interesting.
It's part of spiritual renewal. And I think it works both ways. If somebody becomes a Christian, their heart's turned. If they're a genuine Christian, their heart is turned to be the best dad, the best mum that they can be. On the other hand, if someone is motivated to be a good father, and there are men out there who want to be a good father, and they're looking for examples or guidance, or how do we do that? We have a group that we sometimes speak at of couples and their kids come together to look at issues of parenting together. It's wonderful. But if you have fathers who are not Christians who suddenly, I have a child, I don't want to treat my child the way I was treated, or the way I see it portrayed in the media or round about me. I want to be involved in my son's life. And they go hunting for what that is. That actually opens them up to the Lord as well. It's like the thin end of the wedge, if you like, because the issues of valuing fatherhood means that you're already moving in the direction of valuing the father.
Yeah.
That's how God is called. God's very good at this.
So, yeah, I've heard you say something before. Fatherhood is something that we receive before we ever give it.
Yes.
So every single person in the world, you said in a previous episode, everyone has a father, but everyone has a very different experience of fatherhood.
Yeah.
So if we kind of unpacked what happens to us when we're born, irrespective of what type of father we have, then I'd like to go into how we all deal with the ripple effect of that, good, bad, and ugly. And then I'd like to kind of tail off with this idea of reparenting. So, yeah, talk to us.
Everybody is born with a contribution from father and mother. Okay? It starts with a leaving from the father, a deposit into the mother. Child is born, the child leaves the body of the mother, no longer hosted by the mother, comes out and leaves. Leaving is the first stage of the leaving, cleaving, one flesh process we talked about last time, which is how you build the next generation. So we're all into leaving in different senses and levels right from the beginning. Now, you get to the toddler stage when the child is able to walk. The child starts to explore the world. That is testing out leaving. Falls and hurts his knees, comes crying back to mummy, gets up on the knee, is comforted, wriggles to get off and away again. That in-out dynamic, which is learning to leave in little stages. That makes sense? That sets up a rapport between the parent and the child. Start with the mother, a young child, and with both parents later on. That in-out dynamic continues. It can be marred in two ways. It can be marred by the over-controlling parent who makes the child very dependent on him or her. The child is meeting his or her comfort needs or whatever it might be. And, oh, you poor thing, and all around the child, too much, not letting the child experiment with leaving and practice leaving, knowing that he can come back to safety. And then you have the neglectful parent at the other extreme where they're chatting away, having coffee with their friends, and their child's playing in the pond, and they don't even notice. You know, the child is going into danger, or they don't notice that the child's gone out of the room and they don't know where the child is. Or if the child falls, I'll sort himself. Do you understand? It's the child is let go and is not supervised with a degree of watchfulness, so that if the parent has to intervene, they can intervene. The middle ground, of course, is that the parent allows the child to explore. It's not overly flustered if they do hurt their knees. That's part of growing up. You get hurt sometimes, and that goes throughout life. You try something and it doesn't work. New job fails, you know. You're teaching a child how to handle adversity, how to handle pain, how to handle failure, you know. Child's trying to score a goal and he never scores a goal and he gets frustrated and comes in and kicks the cat. The parent is seeing that and needs to intervene gently but well and decisively to help them say, well, we'll try again. You're getting a bit bigger. You're better than you were 3 weeks ago. You understand? Rather than, that's stupid. You're no good at that game. And the child just gets put down. The parent that intervenes well actually strengthens the child through the fall. See the way you got on your bike there? Was that the wisest way? You know? Tell you another one about a bicycle. You're not to play on your bicycle today, okay? Dad has to fix the brakes, okay? So please don't do it. Child goes and plays with the bicycle, falls off and cuts himself. What does a parent do? Sits back and says, tough, I told you. Runs to the child and shouts at the child, you stupid, disobedient do you understand? Or does the parent go and lift the child who's squealing and comfort that child? And when they're quiet and say, quietly, what did I tell you about the bike? Would it have been better if you had listened? That's teaching the child to have an open ear. Disciples have an open ear.
And it's allowing the child to experience the consequences of their own decisions
without it being
yes,
catastrophic.
And experience reality, because if you don't allow your child to experience reality, you've prepared them to live in a fantasy land that doesn't exist.
Sometimes you have to be very decisive. When I was about 8 or 9, possibly, we were playing cricket. Just beside the road, there was a wall with a fence in it, and somebody hit the ball over the road. Now, there wasn't a lot of traffic in those days. I jumped over the fence, ran straight across the road, and my mother shouted, "Stop!" And I stopped on the white line, and cars passed me on both sides. Just like that. I could have been wiped out. There has to be a decisiveness at some point to say stop, because it can be a life and death thing or a very serious thing. But usually it's taking the child aside after and saying, "You were almost killed there. What are you going to learn from this? What do you need to do?" And the need to look left and right becomes a lot more real when you realize just what has happened.
Right.
You understand? So the things that are communicated in parenting are carried on, and there's this leaving process, out and in process. When you get to teenage years, it's a lot more crucial. It's, "I'm going to the dance tonight. Would you wash my shirt?" It's the dependency thing, the leaving to explore, and the need to come back and have somebody do things for you because you're not competent to do them yourselves, or you don't want to. That's mommy's job or somebody else's job. But the significant thing is this, that the neglectful parent who has learnt that dance with the child where they really don't supervise that well, takes that up into teenage years, and they don't supervise that well, and they don't really address issues, and they don't notice danger coming, and they don't help their child avoid that. Total difference from the early chapters of Proverbs, where a father's talking to his son about a range of things: peer group pressure, how to enter into relationships with the other sex, how to find God, how to seek God. Big things that parents want their children to do well in. So there's not that input in communication. When I was working, we used to have kids who were handed £200, kids from Belfast, anywhere, £200 for the weekend. Go up and spend your weekend in the caravan at Portrush. Unsupervised. You imagine what sorts of stuff they get up to. Now, that's totally neglectful parenting. It's get out of my hair parenting.
Yeah.
Now, the other side is the overpossessive parent develops that dynamic of being overpossessive. We call it being tied to mummy's apron strings, okay? Or having to take on dad's business. There's pressure on the child to be molded to suit the parent in all of that. And the child either succumbs to that and becomes emotionally stunted because they do not grow up and take responsibility for themselves the way they need to. Or there's a big fight and they bust out of that, and then they're alienated from their parent. That may well in some measure be the young man in Luke 15, busting out, but we don't know. And the emotional dynamic has carried the whole way through that was set up in the toddler years. The toddler years are very important. If you can get a balanced parenting in the toddler years, that it becomes an unwritten way of behaving. We talk about things. This is how I approach it. I'm watching you. Go on ahead, but I'm here. And the child grows up in that sort of balance. That child is likely to be balanced. In Psalm 144, it says, "Your sons will be like full-grown plants in their youth," early maturity. That is, if we have had the input to them that is balanced, it allows them to practice leaving, which comes to a head when they leave, get married, and has modeled cleaving so that they know how to cleave, which facilitates ongoing healthy sexual relationship inside the marriage for life, and then in turn produces the most balanced children.
Yeah.
That's the turning of the hearts. That's what's at stake here. not just my children, but my grandchildren. It's an amazing covenant promise at the end of Isaiah 59 that he says something like, the words that I have spoken to you will be in you and in your children and in your children's children from this day forth and forevermore. Every succeeding generation, we've often prayed that for our family, that there would be an input that goes down all the generations until the Lord comes back. And it's interesting, David in some ways missed out as a good parent. In some ways he did a good job. In some ways he was a very poor parent. In some ways he did a good job. But it says of Hezekiah and Josiah, 11 and 14 generations after David, that they walked in the ways of David, their father. That's what it says in 2 Kings or Chronicles, somewhere around there. And you have there many generations and a lot of insight in how the way we behave and what we draw from in our ancestry impacts on what we do in our lives. You have a right to draw everything good from your ancestry, but you have a responsibility not to draw on what's evil.
Wow.
Some people drew on their evil ancestry. Some of the descendants of Jeroboam walked in the way of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. So we choose what we walk in from our ancestry, to our good or to our hurt.
So I think something that's really interesting is when we come to talk about reparenting.
Yes.
And going on a relationship with God where he starts to untangle some of the unhelpful things from our past and maybe strengthen some of the very helpful things that were passed on just from our own fathers.
Yep.
Talk to us about, for a church leader, particularly a pastor, how their good, bad, and ugly experience of their own father actually ripples into how they lead their own congregation.
Well, as I said earlier, if their style of being parented was harshness and a lack of warmth, they don't know how to do that. Unless something happens for them, and being converted, becoming a Christian doesn't automatically mean that's all resolved. It opens the door to it. It opens the door to input from older Christians that can have that input. But that is somewhere in the middle of your spirit and your head. And put in a similar situation, it's just too easy to react that way. Or avoidance, if parents never talked about anything and there's an affair going on in the church and we just, I can't touch that, I don't know what to do. And very true, many people don't know what to do. But the inner feeling is avoidance. And then you come to much more serious things. And the more the church reaches really broken people, the more you're going to bring these things into the church. That's our experience as well. The pastor who has had some sort of balance, either from parenting, hopefully, but certainly through input, not just learning stuff in a Bible college somewhere, but actually input from someone and seeing it modeled in their family and realizing it does impact the future of your kids, the way you relate to them, and it impacts the future of your congregation, the way you relate to them, and making those connections. He then, if he has had a mentor of some sort or a pastor himself that could do that, he has then got a picture in his head of what he can do. And if he can't answer this question, he's somebody to go to get advice from. So it enhances his pastoral input. There are basically 4 things that a pastor needs to do, I think. One is teach about these issues, teach about family, and teach about it with a bit of depth. So they have to be those that are being discipled in their families themselves, because that's where you seek out what the truth is. The second thing is interpreting life to your congregation through God's eyes. My son has died. What do I do? Somehow through God's eyes you can get close to someone whose son also died. If you understand. I was humiliated in work, or whatever it might be. I've lost my job. Is that a change in your life that's coming about? I mean, Jesus lost his carpentry job to move on. There's somehow about helping to interpret life events, particularly difficult life events, in the light of the gospel and the word of God, so that they understand, even in difficult things, God has an input and a purpose. We went through a very difficult situation after we came into the things of the Spirit, and we were in a situation where most of the congregation didn't want to go, was resistant to change. And ultimately, for our own good, we were encouraged to leave and go somewhere. And suddenly we found ourselves with a fellowship of 13 adults and 26 kids that we never intended to be. And we were looking for help on how do you lead a fellowship? Yeah. We hadn't a clue. We got connected with the shepherding movement and had a really helpful input through that from men that were well down the road, both in terms of church planting and in pastoral issues. And that input we found very helpful.
So that became basically the same way you were describing, parents getting around the sofa and workshopping, hey, how do you do this? How do you do that? You started to do that on the pastoral level where you got with other pastors who could give you those insights?
Yes, we did. And they were. And it was helpful. So there's learning to interpret the difficult things. I was going to say about that we felt that as very much as a rejection. We felt we were hungry for God and wanted more. And here we were outside because of the perception that others weren't going that way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. We couldn't tell people what had happened to us in any depth. There were a lot of misperceptions about what had happened to us. 4 years later, we were working with somebody who'd been abused, and we suddenly realised this person has had things happen to them that led to them being put out, and they are not able to talk to people. Suddenly we realised the purpose of our experience for the people that were starting to come for other reasons to see us. And life is like that.
Yeah. Do you think, like, on a much bigger picture, 10,000 foot level, that in a way this is how God, or perhaps why God, either allows or definitely, I should say, uses our negative experiences of fatherhood?
Yes, he does allow them.
It's a Joseph-like experience where he actually, the pain that we experience is then used and transformed into the purposes and plans that God has for our lives.
If there's faith there.
Right.
And Joseph didn't always have an easy ride with his faith, you know. When his brothers came back, he remembered his dreams, which means he'd forgotten his dreams, you know. There's something that died there for him. Then, of course, you're into a bigger principle of death and resurrection. But you're right. God both allows and uses. Anything that happens in your life, God has allowed it. That doesn't mean he wanted it. Because if he was to sort that boy out, he would have to sort this boy out as well, you know.
And we'd all be dead.
It's called the final judgment.
Right.
You know, if he was to be fair. So the interpreting of negative experiences is what Paul does for himself and for his leaders. You know, we were at the point of death, he says at the start of Corinthians, you know, it was really tough. We thought we died. We struggled with lions, I think he says somewhere. And he actually uses his shipwrecks and his beatings to encourage people in a much more volatile situation than we're in to stand firm. So the experience is meant to be passed on in a positive way. I remember someone saying to a pastor, don't get engaged with your congregation. Don't get too close to anybody. It causes problems. That is totally wrong. Paul says, I was like a mother with you.
Well, that's a father wound speaking there, clearly.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. And a father, I mean, 1 Thessalonians, it was like a nurse or a mother nurse and a father, and he felt for them. So there's interpreting life's difficulties, which is a lot of what pastoral care is about. There's modeling fatherhood in his own family. Okay? That's different than teaching it. That's being transparent. There's a phrase called PKs, preacher's kids, and they're notorious for being reprobate.
Yep.
What's happened? That's not the way it's meant to be. That person has moved beyond qualification for being a leader. Needs to do something else, sort out his home territory first. And then finally the fourth one is...
What do you think is going on with PKs?
I think they see the difference between the message and the lived reality.
Right. Actually, I saw a study recently from, I can't remember who it was, maybe Barna or somebody like that. And they did a study on PKs. And they're like, what is the reason why so many walk away from the faith? And it's exactly what you said. It's hypocrisy.
It's hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Yep. The word Hippocrates is the word that the Greek actors use for a mask. That is, they put it in front of their face to indicate which character they were.
Right.
It's not the real person. Okay, it's preaching mumps and having measles. You're back to that sort of thing.
Sorry, you were about to say the fourth thing.
The fourth thing is then being a father to people who were unfathered. Timothy had a father who was a Greek. He had a physical father, we all do, and a mother who was a Jewess who had faith, and a granny who had faith. So his spiritual input sounds as if it came from females.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he was keen. He was a good Christian. But there was a big gap in his life because his father was a Greek, presumably not a believer, and therefore had no spiritual input into him. And Paul calls him my son. Mm-hmm. He talks to others about my son Timothy.
Mm-hmm.
And he inputted to Timothy. He brought Timothy with him. He saw the potential and the gifting, but he saw the deficits, and he filled that. He gave him phenomenal tasks. When he wrote the 2 apostolic letters to Timothy, Timothy was leading or having apostolic input to the church in Ephesus. That's rather a big thing. I believe it was something like 50,000 people scattered throughout Ephesus. It was a big place. So he was enough of a father, and Timothy was enough of a son that he could give him a massive responsibility. And that is a relational thing. He was reparenting Timothy in how to relate. He did know in a fashion, because his mum was committed to him, obviously, and his granny. But this was man-to-man stuff. And ultimately, all children need man to child. They need father to child. Just as you need a father to produce a child, you need a father to raise a child.
Yeah.
Not just a father. It's tough if you're a father on your own. You need a mother as well. But the older the child gets, the more important the role of the father is. And you go to Proverbs, written by Solomon, who didn't do a brilliant job either in marriage or parenting himself, but who had a lot of wisdom from God about it. And he talks as a father to his sons. My son or my sons comes 23 times in the book of Proverbs. So this is a father communicating with his children about all sorts of issues, about how to handle the other sex, how to handle money, many, many things.
Final question, Willie. Final question of the whole series.
Okay.
Better make it a good one. For the person who's listened to all of these, or even just this episode, particularly the church leaders listening, and they have really identified that there is some reparenting that needs to happen in their own life, whether it's resolving father wounds from the past or restoring fatherhood towards their own kids or even their own congregation. As a next step, what would you encourage them to do?
It's a big question, and it probably will not be the same answer for everybody. Do what you can do. That's all you can do. So read There are books on it. Identify in your own experience someone that you know that's significantly further down the road than you are, that you can have input from. Age is not the issue here. Somebody said you can have 40 years experience or you can have 1 year's experience 40 times. Which do you want? So it's someone who is further down the road in these issues. Timothy was pastoring older men because he's told to respect them as fathers, but he's there with the spiritual responsibility. And many of them may not have been particularly well fathered. So he has to approach them as a respectful son-like figure, but also as their shepherd. Shepherd doesn't just shepherd lambs, they shepherd sheep, through their whole life cycle. So identify someone and go and say, can we meet? And hopefully they will respond to that. And that's just meeting around the Word of God, praying together, having a place to share. And as that time goes on, that'll get more real. If there are leadership groups or teams that can provide that sort of input, that's great as well. You get peer group support, people who know what it's like to pastor and not know what they're supposed to be doing, I'm hesitant to say go to Bible college because in my experience, Bible colleges do not come near the input on practical pastoring that is needed. It's a lot of theological stuff, but the input around dealing with all the issues we've talked about in this series and more in depth and giving people time to process that is absolutely needed. And if it's not provided in Bible college, it needs to be provided somewhere. Thankfully, there are organizations that run courses in this, that, and the other. All of those are helpful. But you need to know what God has provided for you in your situation. And at least go to someone who you think might be able to point you. They may not be able to do it, but they can point you. But sitting and doing nothing is not the best way. If you do not have a father figure, you have no one to shoot you out as a polished arrow into the purpose of God. And that is one of the pictures of children in the Old Testament. It's warfare out there. There's warfare on the family. There's warfare on marriage. There's warfare against parenting and children. Abortion's warfare. If we can turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the ways of the just, that's turning them to people, then that prepares the people for the Lord, prepares the nation for the Lord. Now, I may only have a glass full of water, and there's a whole of Northern Ireland and UK and the world, Well, I would rather be pushing in the right direction than the wrong direction.
Absolutely. If you have enjoyed this series and you'd like more resources, more support, more help, there'll be a link to the Family Spectrum website, wherever it is that you're listening or watching this video. There'll also be a link to Willie's book on fatherhood, The Loss and Restoration of Fatherhood. And there's many other books that you've written across
a
whole range of
child
topics.
Abuse in the church, yeah.
Yeah. And
the podcasts will be on the website as well eventually. They're not immediately, but they will be eventually.
Don't worry. We'll get you sorted with that. But generally, Willie, I know that this series was something that you guys have put a lot of thought and prayer into. And I know it's very, very important to you guys. And I just want to say thank you. Like, personally, I've learned a tremendous amount through this entire process. Producer Daniel here's nodding his head as well. And good. So thank you for doing this. And for any church leader or indeed anyone who's listened or watched these, it's like our prayer for you is that you'll find them beneficial and that they will encourage you on the path that God has you on. So, Willie?
The ministries of Family Spectrum is primarily aimed at supporting leaders, tackling difficult situations or difficult issues. That's the primary purpose.
So there's help out there.
A little.
A glass of water.
A glass of water, absolutely.
Willie, thank you for your time and all the work you've put into this. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.